Here's something that quietly happened this week. The cabinet approved a change to what's called Press Note 3, a rule that's been on the books since 2020, which basically said if you are a Chinese investor, you need the Indian government's approval before you can put in a single rupee into an Indian company. No exceptions. That rule is now being loosened. Not removed, loosened. How? If a fund or company has less than 10% Chinese beneficial ownership, it can now invest in Indian companies through the automatic route, which means without waiting for any approval. Beneficial owner? Someone who actually benefits from an investment. The real person or entity behind the money, even if it's coming through a fund or intermediary. And for priority sectors like electronics and capital goods, the government must now decide on Chinese proposals within 60 days. The question is, why now and what does it actually mean? Listen on, it's Friday the 13th of March. I'm Anirban Chowdhury. This is the Morning Brief. Okay, so why now? Look at what's actually happening to India's capital flows, and it's not a pretty picture. While gross FDI equity inflows in April to December 2025 rose a robust 20% year-on-year to $47.9 billion, the net picture tells a very different story. Net FDI has been squeezed by a significant rise in repatriations and disinvestments. RBI reported that net FDI fell 52% year-on-year as recently as June 2025, collapsing to just $1 billion from $2.2 billion in the same month the previous year. Meanwhile, foreign institutional investors or FIIs have been pulling out of Indian equity markets at a record pace. Here's Biswajit Dhar, retired professor, Center for Economic Studies and Planning, JNU.
The situation is pretty grim. The past few years, we have seen foreign direct investment stagnating at a level. But more importantly, the disinvestments have been very high. As a result, the net inflows have actually come down quite substantially. Again, it is very interesting to see, and for me, it's quite a concern, that India's investments abroad, FDI abroad, has actually gone up to record levels. In the April to December, the 9 months of this fiscal, investment abroad has been about $25 billion, which is really unprecedented. So for a country which is really capital short, we know that the private sector is not investing to the extent it should. And of course, and I didn't mention foreign institutional investors, until yesterday, the net outflows, the net disinvestment was more than $11 billion. We are almost reaching record levels ever on this. So you have this scenario of leakages taking place all around. And therefore, I think this is what the government of India has decided, that let us go easy on Chinese investors, because China last year, their outward investment has been close to $140 billion, and it is an 18% jump over 2024. So I think all these things are adding up to the PN3, the Press Note 3. And that's why I think the timing is being dictated by all these factors that I just mentioned.
But the catalysts are also global. The Middle East crisis has disrupted supply chains worldwide. Western economies, battered by years of military spending and geopolitical friction, are less flush with investable capital than they once were. The United States has pushed Europe into heavy defense expenditure, and the transactional uncertainty of the Trump era has unsettled long-term investment calculus. In such a scenario, countries in the global south would realize it may make more sense to work together, in some respects at least. Here's Amitendu Palit, a global trade expert at the Institute of South Asian Studies, National University of Singapore.
Now, Both India and China, along with a large number of other countries of the world, and here I specifically refer to even the European countries or other G7 countries, these countries have been showing the proclivity to talk a lot more amongst themselves over the last 5 to 6 months. And with India as well, we have seen a large number of parallel engagements taking place with European Union, with Canada, with New Zealand, Australia, and so on and so forth. I think India and China both realize that both their economies are too large to be managed within a limited domain. They are vulnerable to external occurrences. And this really necessitates that they both work and explore each other's respective strengths, where both can benefit from each other. It's just a question of India allowing China put in a certain amount of capital into a specific number of sectors where it wants to build capacities. And on the other hand, China realizing that India is a country which is really keen on building capacities. And if the Chinese can get a stake in however small and well defined volume it might be in India's expanding sectors, it's of use for China as well.
So then the obvious question is, if given a more unrestricted flow than before, where would Chinese money go? And wouldn't India be careful about which sectors it wants to open up, given prior security concerns? Here's Professor Dhar.
Yeah, I think, there's been a lot of emphasis that the government has put on this entire area of electronics, electronic components, etc. And of course, in the current budget, the latest budget, on the establishment of data centers. Now, the data centers is a big thing for the government, talking about India becoming a data center hub. And the incentive that has been given by the finance minister is also pretty attractive. A tax-free kind of a regime until 2047. So there are 21-year tax-free regime. Now, the Chinese could actually be looking at that area. For one, all these issues regarding data portability and all, they will disappear because foreign companies will be actually working on Indian data. So all this problem that we have seen on electronic commerce and the digital trade, on this whole issue of data portability, that could actually disappear in a jiffy. But again, the point is that whether government of India is going to feel safe, and like you asked, that there could be security concerns. What kind of additional security protocols the government of India can bring in now, since they have unlocked the door? The government has to look at itself and see what all needs to be done to assure the Indian businesses and Indian public that we are in safe hands.
And here's Amitendu.
My sense is a lot will depend upon the sector where the proposal has been submitted and what is the value of that sector in terms of, number one, the economic benefits it can generate, because economic benefits can overweigh a certain amount of reservation that might come in on the other side. But it also depends upon how security sensitive this particular sector is. I think the amendment makes it pretty much clear if there are sectors like telecom and all, they are not really going to be a part of this story. It's more in the question of startups or some such tech ventures that we are talking about. So technically, I am of the opinion that investments should not be a problem, subject to the specific content of the proposal.
Now, the most technically significant element of the amendment is the codification of the beneficial owner definition. The Prevention of Money Laundering Act, or PMLA in India, defines a beneficial owner as a person who holds a controlling ownership interest of more than 10% of the shares, capital, or profits of a company. This immediately raises a practical questions that investors, legal teams, and fund managers are wrestling with. What about indirect holdings? Here's Professor Dhar.
Now, what happens to the overall investment of that entity that it's investing in? That's not anyone's concern. The government is not interested in that. So anyone who's a direct beneficiary will actually be getting this benefit. Now, even in foreign investment cases, foreign investment which comes, where the foreign investor has a 10% stake or 10% or more, is treated as direct investment, stated as a direct beneficiary. And that is what is being extended here, in my view.
So, consider a Singapore based private equity fund with 20% Chinese investor participation that wants a 20% stake in an Indian company. The effective Chinese economic exposure is just 4%. Nevertheless, this still triggers government approval even under the eased Press Note 3, right?
Exactly.
Now, the other question is, what does this opening up signal to global investors at large? Does it make the Indian investment climate more predictable, more conducive? Here's Amitendu.
There's a very nuanced point to be understood over here that when one looks at investors now and the way they look at respective economies, they're not just looking at macroeconomic stability. They're also looking at the capacity of that particular location to stay resilient under a variety of exogenous disturbances. Now, today, if you look at a country like India, what you see is that this is a country which has performed very well as far as macroeconomics is concerned. But when it comes to the geopolitical content of its external engagement, it still doesn't stand on a very stable footing with the world's two most major powers. Now, this one step, the fact that it has opened itself up to Chinese investments, unlocking the barrier which it had created 6 years ago, is a very important signal because it signals a certain degree of confidence and practicality and rationality on part of India. And that signal, I'm sure, is going to be noted well by global investors. I think it should act as an accelerator.
And the last question for now is, what comes next? Further liberalization in Indo-China investment relations? Tighter scrutiny? Or both? Here's Professor Dhar.
I feel there's going to be further easing. There is no other way going forward. Of course, the big issue is whether the Chinese investors would be really interested in investing in India. Because, see, the optics in the past have been pretty negative. When the Chinese companies were operating in India, they had some huge problems with their workforce. There was a lot of hostility. And also, I think the political environment has to improve further. And I would say the political relations between the two countries have to improve further for the Chinese investors to feel assured. Now, as I said, that China has really emerged as a very large investor, and the West is really reeling under all kinds of pressures. Their fund position looks pretty dim. US has overinvested in the wars. It has pushed Europe into spending huge amounts in defense. I would expect that investments from these countries, from the Western, the major economies, would actually slow down in the coming years unless the global situation actually improves. I don't think this is going to happen as long as Donald Trump is there in the White House.
Here's Amitendu.
We are not even looking at the kind of cooperation that India and China can create, given the fact that both of them have very effectively shifted to digital currencies. Both of them have unleashed sovereign digital currencies. And both of them are willing to break out of a financial trading mechanism, an exchange mechanism, which makes them totally reliant on the dollar. Now, once that happens, you can actually see a very new sphere of economic engagement beginning between India and China. You actually might get to see a new era of tech-oriented services. And if that happens, then obviously the current context of the Press Note number 3 and its amendment should be expanded further. And I think both countries are aware of this possibility. But compared with the past, I think on this occasion, even if the Press Note number 3 is expanded further in terms of its amended scope, which I think is very likely, I think what we are also going to see is a steady mechanism of scrutiny. So there's going to be this combination that, yes, more Chinese investments are welcome, but welcome on our specific terms and without compromising on security concerns, which is a perfectly legitimate position to take.
For now, the government has unlocked the door. The formal notification will give us more clarity on some of the blurry aspects, like indirect investments. The key question, whether Chinese capital walks through it, and on whose terms will define the next chapter of India's most complicated economic relationship. That's it for today. You were listening to this episode on The Morning Brief. It was produced by me and Vinay Joshi, sound designed by Rajas Naik. A new episode of The Morning Brief drops every Tuesday, Thursday, and Friday, wherever you get your podcasts. Stay tuned, keep listening.